Good evening. We're going to start the discussion. My name's Josie Appleton, and I'm director of Manifesto Club, which has nothing to do with jihadism. But I read and write, and I'm an interested person. So I think that really the phenomenon that we have of violent jihadism in terms of attacks in Western cities has become an ever-present part of everyday life and an ever-present possibility, especially if you go to France or Paris. And I think that when this emerged in the 90s, there was a kind of recognition it was something quite different and quite distinct. And it attracted the attention of people like the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard, who was trying to theorize the changes in the social systems of that time. It was seen as very, very, very unusual. And there are a lot of explanations given for this in terms of, is it ancient religion? Is it basically anti-imperialist protest? Is it teenage angst? And whilst the numbers of fighters from European countries are relatively small, in the hundreds, I think that there's still a recognition this is an extremely telling and worrying phenomenon, which speaks probably to two fractures in societies much deeper than their actual relatively small numbers. So to discuss this question today, we have four very good speakers. To start, we have Dr. Omar Ashur, who's a senior lecturer in Middle East politics and security studies at the University of Exeter, and he's author also of the de-radicalization of Islamists, and tells me he's writing on ISIS at the moment. Then we have Emma Webb, who's a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, and she's co-author of An Enduring Threat, Europe's Islamist Terror Networks Then and Now. And then third, we have Zubeda Limbada, who is director of Connect Futures and author of Formers and Families of Violent Extremists. And finally, we have Bill Derodier, who's head of international relations at Bath University and author of lots of things. Okay, so all speakers will have 5 minutes or so, and then we'll have a brief discussion and come out to the audience. Okay, we'll start, Omar.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation and the introduction. I'm just going to throw a few thoughts that I had on the what we can describe as a wave of political violence and terrorism that struck Europe in the aftermath of 9/11. So if you draw the line on at 9/11 and afterwards, basically the frequency and intensity of this wave is much less than the wave that struck Europe in the 70s and the 80s. So we're talking about the maximum number of fatalities in 2004 after the Madrid bombings were 194 fatalities. In comparison to that, the maximum number in 1979 was 1,019 fatalities, so about 7 times higher. Mainly perpetrated at that time, the wave was perpetrated by a European organization, the IRA, ETA, the organizations that operated in the years of the lead, between quotations, in Italy. So in terms of the intensity, the wave in the 70s and the 80s were higher. We had one attack in 1988, the Lockerbie attack perpetrated by agents of Mr. Gaddafi, killed 440 fatalities in one operation in 1988, again higher than any other number of fatalities in a given year after 9/11. So with that said, we need to remember this for some reasons. One of them for the societal resilience, but also to understand the capacities of the threat and how much damage it can do, and therefore to react and formulate security policies accordingly. The other observation is how different is the current threat that we face today. One of the major differences is that it stems outside of Europe. It stems from, if the wave of the 70s and the 80s were unresolved European political crises or political and social crises, the current wave has to do with unresolved crises, mainly in the Middle East. Jihadism and takfirism, the two ideologies that more or less legitimate the part of the current wave, were born in Egyptian prisons after waves of, mainly in reaction to mass tortures and a couple of massacres that happened in the 50s. And then after that, the logistics and the capacities, the organizational buildup, the political violence skills, if you wish, the military, the urban terrorism capacities, the guerrilla capacities, were built along 3 decades between Afghanistan, Egypt, Algeria, later on at later stage after 2011, Syria and Libya. So more or less stems from outside of Europe. Part of the problems as well is the objectives. The objectives of the current wave, if you look, depends on which organization we're talking about, because jihadism is like that, and then the subcategories within jihadism are quite significant, and the organizations that operate in these subdivisions are also have different objectives sometimes. But if you looked at an organization like IS, its objective is maximalist. It's unachievable, intertwined to a certain degree with dogma. So you had the famous speech of Mr. Adnani, that if we can avoid fighting one enemy, we would do so, but it is a matter of dogma. So basically, dogma says fight everybody, including Al-Qaeda, by the way. With this, when you have this kind of rhetoric, of course, it does not correspond necessarily to the behavior, but it's very maximalist. Also, the toleration of violence is quite high. So the notice that the IRA used to give, the notice period, evacuate the place before the bomb gets detonated, these notices are no longer there. The toleration to mass casualty is quite high in the case of IS, and to a certain degree with the case of Al-Qaeda, although there was revisions at a later stage because of the repercussions and the reactions. So to a certain degree, these are some of the distinctions of this current wave that we face today. There is also a couple of other things that I need to highlight, because the question that was raised, I guess, is how political is Islamist political violence. It is a very much a hybrid animal. It's the ideology and narrative does not necessarily determine organizational behavior. So you will have the narrative and the ideology would be going on one side, and then the behavior would conflict with that. And if anyone is in doubt, you can look a bit into the relationship between IS, the oil sales of IS on one end, and the buyers from the Assad regime on the others, and the benefits that come from both, although they're fighting at one end, but also trading on the other. There is also the idea that politics doesn't matter. It's a matter of dogma. So we need to take that out with a bit of caution, because if you looked at the stats, the attacks after October 2014, after the intervention, the coalition's intervention to undermine ISIS in Iraq and Syria, which needed to be done, but if you looked at that, the levels of the attacks increased. We were talking the difference between October 2014 and April 2016. There was about 31 alleged plots and attacks. If you looked prior to that period, from April 2013, when ISIS was established, to October 2014, before the intervention, we're talking about 3 attacks, 2 plots and 1 attack on European soil. So the difference, again, is about 10 times. Final note, environment here matters. The security threats are sustainable, because whereas Europe fixed or tried to fix its internal problems, and therefore to deal with these waves of terrorism and political violence that struck it in the 70s and the 80s, there is a constant failure to do so in the Middle East region. And it does not, my opinion, this is debated, but my opinion, it doesn't have to do a lot with the culture or the religion. It has to do with one of the very low quality elites that rule in this region. The failure to compromise on the elite level, the failure to always approach zero-sum games. We can give some examples maybe in the Q&A period, but if you looked at the Assads and the Qaddafis and the Salehs and the Sisis of the world, I was doing this interview with one of the militias, basically one of the militia members who were fighting against ISIS, just to understand how do they fight exactly. And he was from Syria, and he basically gave me this interesting quote. I would surrender to a Gandhi, to a Mandela, or to a Lincoln. But I would rather die under ISIS flag rather than to surrender to an Assad or to Gaddafi or to a Sisi. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Omar. Emma.
So there are lots of things that I could say about what I think makes ISIS different from older networks and Al-Qaeda specifically. But I'd like to talk a little bit more, not so much on the topic itself, because I'm sure that will come out more in the Q&A, but about the debate and the way that the debate pans out. Because after every terror attack, we frequently hear the same arguments over and over again. And the debate, I think, has become quite stagnant. So today we have an opportunity with so many people who have come together in one place who are willing to discuss these kinds of things, that I think that we shouldn't waste the opportunity for a little bit of collective self-reflection on why it is that the debate seems to be getting nowhere. So I would like to put to you today that the problem is at least in part to do with the question. I think that we've focused too much on questions of definition, and it's started to sound a little bit like we're trying to guess the weight of a cake, asking how much Islam is in it, how much politics is in it. So I think it would benefit for us to think about how we might reframe the debate. Mendelssohn, in his book Jerusalem, talked about how sometimes we have truths that we inherit that weren't initially self-evident, but over time they become so. And I think that that is, it seems to me, is what may have stunted this debate in terms of our framing. So I'll just give you a quick example of this. Ben McIntyre wrote a piece for The Times in which he claimed that the presence of former regime elements from Saddam's government in ISIS were indicative of the fact that ISIS is being driven by politics rather than by religion. And he gave the example of Haji Bakr, who was previously, he'd been a colonel in Saddam's military intelligence, and then he'd gone on to be al-Baghdadi's right-hand man. And when he was killed in 2014, they discovered a document which has been described as a blueprint for ISIS's takeover. And I quote Ben McIntyre, he says, not a manifesto of faith. He points out that no Qurans were found in Haji Bakr's house. And he says that ISIS portrays itself as a pure religious revolution, but he claims that actually ISIS have two faces: the former regime element, which is the real driving force, the powerhouse behind it, and that the religious element is just a facade. And we get a similar framing with people like Dalia Mogherhead and Mark Sageman, who are essentially asking what came first, the chicken or the egg. They want to know whether it is the case that ISIS is really politics in religious attire. And I think that this is a mistake. Firstly, because it's driven by a presupposition of the separation between religion and politics, which is something that we take for granted here, but is still something which is unusual in human history and also in the rest of the world today. It's something that ISIS as a phenomenon explicitly reject, and I don't think that that sort of way of approaching Islamic State really fits. It also assumes that religion couldn't possibly be the driving, motivating force behind a person's behaviour. Again, this is something that is probably true in London, but not necessarily in Saudi Arabia. And I think secondly, and more importantly, I think this misunderstands the way that things work in human heads. It's very difficult to untangle human motivations. And the assumption is that if we could figure out whether or not it is the case that politics is the cause and religion is just the justification, I think we should ask ourselves whether or not it would matter if we knew the answer to that question. Because the assumption there is that if politics is the cause, then the justification can only run skin deep. And it may be the case that you agree with people like Peter Neumann, who think that the theology of Islamic State is unsophisticated. But Islamic State have given us every reason to think that they take their religion very seriously, and that even if their views are unsophisticated, they still hold them very deeply. We have the argument that Islam is just the common parlance of the region at the moment in the Middle East, in the way that previously Arab nationalism was. But nobody would have ever questioned whether an Arab nationalist deeply held their Arab national beliefs in the same way that the debate often assumes that it does. So I think it doesn't really seem to me what matters came first, the chicken or the egg. So just to finish, I'm a big believer that if you want to know somebody's motivations, you should just ask them. And that means listening to what Islamic State is saying to us rather than always responding by saying, but this is really what they mean. So on that note, I'll just finish by trying to at least hint towards answering the two questions, whether ISIS is nihilistic and whether it has anything to do with Islam. Usually when there's a terror attack, we hear the same two arguments recited. One of those is represented by the Pope after the Nice attacks, when he said that that we're not at war with religion and that religions are peaceful. Not that you think he might have a slight vested interest. But and we have people like Obama and Clinton, Kerry, they will say it's nihilistic, it's a death cult and so on. So I just want to give you something that I think might sort of kickstart some debate, because there, in an issue of the 15th issue of Dabiq, Islamic State really addressed the question for us and addressed us here today. This issue was published after Omar Mateen had gone and shot gay men in a nightclub in Orlando. And Islamic State wrote that they were already aware that Westerners were claiming that these attacks were senseless and I quote, questioning incessantly. And they give many reasons in this article that is entitled Why We Hate You and Why We Fight You. And among those reasons were our secularism, atheism, our rejection of the oneness of God, which are things that you might expect. But they finish, and so will I, on this, I think, amusing quote. And they said, so you can continue to believe that those despicable terrorists hate you because of your lattes and your Timberlands, and continue spending ridiculous amounts of money to try to prevail in an unwinnable war. Or you can accept reality and recognize that we will never stop hating you until you embrace Islam. These don't sound to me like the words of somebody who believes in the radical repudiation of meaning and value, as Nietzsche put it. Islamic State do, I think, have an ideological and theological context. That doesn't mean that Islam inevitably leads to violence. It doesn't mean that Islam is not a peaceful religion. And again, going back to what Omar said, it doesn't mean that politics don't matter and that there are no other factors at play. But I think it is enough for us to at least consider that Islam is an inextricable part of ISIS, and we're not going to be able to understand Islamic State unless we understand their Islam. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma.
Great. So since 9/11, there's been a trend to allude to new terror which falsely and unhelpfully severs current acts from the longer history and connections with other forms of political violence. There's considerable discussion about whether the current terrorism of jihad is a new phenomenon related to its base in increased religiosity and divine duty. It's indiscriminate rather than targeted attacks, and its lack of desire to negotiate. Yet the term new jihadism describes something that's not new per se, but relates more to aspects of technology, targets, and recruitment. The new terror is portrayed as more nihilistic in its apparent absence of an understandable morality. Yet this is not meaningless violence for its own ends, as in some definitions of nihilism. In contrast, these are acts strongly connected to meaning, political, social, and ideological, that reflects the context of perpetrators and victims. And obviously, just as kind of my side issue, I would also say that when we look at this topic, we should also look at things like far-right extremism to provide the context. So let's talk about different country approaches in USA and Germany, where different political overtones are observed. So take, for example, the massacres of 9 African Americans in Charleston in 2016, which was seen as a hate crime, not terrorism, carried out by a 21-year-old white man who once wore an apartheid badge and other symbols of white supremacy. In America, gun violence deaths can be seen as a domestic crime and not political, and definitely not terrorism. There's also a federal ban on research of addressing gun violence and its causes, which one could argue means the ban on researching is a political act by the state, even if gun violence can cause terror on the wider population at large. I would argue that even in psychopathic cases, there's inevitably a political context to violence, in this instance related to gun ownership. Compare this with Germany in July 2016 in Munich, where 9 people were killed. It was reported one of the gunmen shouted Allahu Akbar, God is great, while firing his Glock into a crowd in McDonald's. The Munich chief of police was very quickly dismissed any links with Islamist extremism. And he said, and I quote, even if he would have said this, it would not automatically indicate anything. Not everyone who uses this saying, which is now famous around the world, is automatically linked to IS. His measured response is a valuable way of positively downplaying the threat of terror and balancing the impact of fear and terror that adherents of IS try to create. A different politicized response would have generated equally politicized public relations. So how do the push and pull narratives of ideology and conviction link in with the so-called Islamic State and their political messaging of combining ideology and fear? So there's around 6,000 foreign terrorist fighters as of 2016, with a substantial number from the UK, Germany and France. The would-be Khilafah, or the Caliphate, has a clear state-building objective, but people who join IS are joining a political process through an element of choice to be part of a movement and the wider family. Those individuals leaving from the West appear to be rejecting liberal democracies of the countries that they live in, rejecting their families and society at large, and with it, the opportunities, both good and bad, that come with it. In effect, they embrace a new social contract. Violent jihadist groups such as IS do have a strongly articulated political vision, conveyed through a mixture of religious edicts and or social messaging that conveys the redemption, adventure and excitement aspects. And it may explain, for example, why 15-year-old girls from London, one of whom secretly stole from her parents to pay for the journey to Syria, who would never have a fighting role as a woman in the battlefield, through to someone like Yusuf Sawar from Birmingham, who had purchased an Islam for Dummies book before going to Syria to demonstrate the extent of religious practice and knowledge of his own faith. So while the ultimate aim of IS may be to destroy the West and its notion of democracy, I'd argue that more than any other jihadist groups, including AQ, it recognised the need early on to go beyond simplistic anti-Western statements and to articulate that a functioning state with borders implementing day-to-day laws, hudud, was an equally strong part of its political message to attract outsiders. It was both the politics and the faith. Ultimately, the state was a living and functioning political body. And many, but not all, individuals who attempted to join the group or make the hijrah would have been aware of this. So this would mean they would have been radicalized before they made that journey. They would believe in that even if their particular understanding and their motivations would be different. Now, while some people would put weight on religion being a key motivating factor, I'd argue that religion is secondary for the most part, as it's still only linked to an underlying dominant ideology that underpins and binds the vision together, much like the Marxist system. It is, however, worth noting that they are individuals whose interest in joining such groups is indeed nihilistic, but whose journeys cannot be understood without the social and the political context from when they came. So it brings me to the point around how nihilism and terror needs to look at vulnerabilities. If you look at countries such as France, where you've got problems around post-social housing, Islamophobia, high unemployment, and it lends itself to grievances to minority groups such as Muslims who may feel outside of the framework when politicians remind them to follow laïcité, égalité, etc. And the impact of being reminded that you're not French enough or even British enough, for example, can be juxtaposed with the simple IS messaging that a Muslim can practice Islam freely and safely, wear the Islamic clothing and live in a Muslim society, thus bringing people politically closer to IS messaging. I agree this is simplified, but in essence, they go to Syria to feel closer to the vision that's enhanced by IS, which provides the camaraderie, the adventure, the sister brotherhood, and religion. And it's by this point that IS has to convince you that this is the socio-political deal you're signing up to. It's this contract and conviction they provide before the journey which is essential, because it's probably one of the few ways in which IS can convince young men and women to commit horrible acts, including beheading. And similarly, far-right groups exploit feelings of disenfranchisement, marginalisation and victimisation to attract individuals to a political vision of white power and nationalism. So to conclude, the shifting political targets of extremist groups needs nuanced analysis. Hatred of groups which tries to nullify by extinction, genocide, or expulsion should be distinguished from hatred of governments or the West, where the endpoint of nihilistic destruction is less clear. If the caliphate becomes less possible with the retaking of IS areas, which is currently happening in Mosul, then will the new jihadism revert to the more nihilistic, negative attempts at undermining governments through terror, as with AQ and Al-Shabaab? The impact has to be measured not through the acts themselves, but through government reactions. So in this sense, violence is always political, either in intent or capability or in response. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If you go online, I think even today, although I'm not recommending you do this, you'll find there's an IS English language video called The End of Sykes-Picot. And in The End of Sykes-Picot, which refers to the treaty between the French and the British to carve up the Middle East after the Ottoman Empire, you find a Chilean convert to the Islamic State kicking over a sign on the Iraqi-Syria border that's held to be the Sykes-Picot line, before taking you in a documentary style on a tour inside a captured military base. And he then talks to some captured Syrian soldiers who are behind bars, just talks to them amicably about what's going on, all sorts of other things. And then he drives out of the compound in an SUV, and the next thing you see is the entire compound exploding. And as I said, the remarkable thing about this is just the casual, banal nature of it. There are no demands made. There are no confessions sought from the prisoners. And in that regards, what might initially, if you were only to look at it superficially, appear to be political because it refers to Sykes-Picot, is actually the very opposite of political. It opposes sovereignty. It's anti-political. In some ways, of course, and I'll touch on this a bit later, it mirrors some of their perceptions of what the United States does when it launches drone attacks remotely on people in Pakistan. But of course, if you're mirroring your opponent, you're also trying to disavow any responsibility for your own actions. And in that regards, I do consider it not to be political. Nihilism, if we take it to mean that life essentially is perceived to have no purpose or meaning, if we look at, say, Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and psychoanalyst who wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, in it he makes the point that it's not suffering that destroys people. You know, and he had seen suffering close up in the Holocaust. He says it's not suffering that destroys people, it's suffering without meaning. In other words, if you know, understand, believe in maybe the suffering that you're undergoing, then human beings are prepared to tolerate a remarkable amount of suffering in pursuit of a cause, a mission, or a belief. But in an age when there is no meaning, and in that regards I'd refer to Zaki Laïdi's book, the French political scientist at Sciences Po, who wrote a book, Un monde privé de sens, which means a world without meaning, which was his description of what happened to the world after the end of the Cold War. In a world without meaning, then suffering becomes intolerable, and we see different types of rage as people are unable to tolerate even marginal hardships that in the past would have been considered just part of life. In a world without meaning, Laïdi looks at how the end of the Cold War effectively opened the floodgates to all manner of belief systems that had been held in check through the realpolitik of the Cold War. If you're facing off the Soviet Union fully armed with nuclear missiles and chemical and biological weapons capabilities, it slightly limits the possibilities of advanced post-structuralist discourse analysis. But he basically points out that then the floodgates opened, and there's a sense that all human purpose is a vanity, not just for jihadists, and this is the key point I want to make in this, but for all of us. In a way, we're all nihilists now, because none of us has any meaning. The nihilist celebrates the act. By celebrating the act, they consciously bypass the people. The people are simply too thick, too lazy, too fallible. They have given up on the people. People who celebrate the act have essentially given up on the labor of love, which it is to engage people intellectually and use the power of persuasion to bring them over to your point of view. When you give up on them, then you take part in mindless, destructive actions, or other types of actions, which I'll touch on. It's people who've given up on democracy and progress, but we could say that many of our governments appear to have given up on democracy and progress as well. And then it replaces that with simplistic slogans. You're either with us or against us, or some other type of slogan. Terrorism today, and this is where I disagree with some of the other panelists here, it is actually very different to the past. Terrorism has become an end in itself. In the past, the Palestine Liberation Organization or the Irish Republican Army would have used terrorism as a means to achieving a broader political end. And in that sense, they had a very strong sense that they needed to engage a community in their, whether it was West Belfast or the West Bank, in a narrative, in a political discussion, in order to make people consciously engaged and part of the solution. They didn't just do terrorist acts. In other words, what we're seeing is that, again, people who've given up on the power of persuasion, and indeed destroy themselves in the process when they don't even need to. I mean, the London bombers are a perfect example of that. They could have left their backpacks on the tube or on the bus. They could have walked away to fight another day. And that's the ultimate nihilism, where they have given up so much that they give up on themselves at the same time. Nihilist culture also leads to narcissistic individuals, people who are obsessed with the phrase, "I want to make a difference," which I hear endlessly from my students, I have to say, without a considerable amount of reflection of what it is that they want to make a difference is, and the need to engage with others in the project of making a difference. So I remember in the run-up to the Beijing Olympics, some rather posh-sounding students who were caught shinning up lampposts in Beijing to hang up Free Tibet posters, who were feted by their parents when they landed back at Heathrow Airport, who were saying, "My child, is morally righteous and wanting to make a difference." Had they consulted the people of Tibet? Had they engaged in a political discussion about this? I rather doubt it. Similarly, the people who cut through the fences at Heathrow Airport and sit in the middle of the runway, disrupting thousands of people's lives, including people going possibly to, the funeral of a loved one. Do they engage in a political debate? Do they consider the need to discuss these actions with others? No, they act in a way like terrorists. They are so morally convinced of their righteousness that they do not need to consult us, as indeed the terrorists do not consult the Ummah, or the community of Muslim believers. They just act with little analysis, little engagement. Terrorism as an act of disgust against imperialism or consumerism may be very public in form, but it is ultimately private and limited in character. The young bombers in London had not shared their values or ideas or beliefs with their friends and family. That's why one of the families phoned up on the day to find out from the police, because their young son had gone to London that day and they were concerned that he might have been caught up in the atrocities without realizing that actually he was part of the perpetrators. We saw the same again more recently in Los Angeles. I think not believing in popular agency or rejecting the sovereign nation and its agentic subjects as the subjects of history, the people who make history, who are us in this room and the people outside of here, is ultimately why terrorism today is neither political nor particularly religious, but I can come back on that in the discussion, but just pure nihilist end in itself. Louise Richardson, the new Vice-Chancellor of the University of Oxford, is famous for having written one book, What Terrorists Want. I think the real question that we need to ask in this session is, what do we want? Who are we? What do we stand for? Where are we going? Because if we don't know what we want, we're not in a position to judge others and to interdict them in our presumed certainty that they're just wrong. I think the confusion and the nihilism starts very much at home. And my very final point is that extremism ultimately is simply the extreme expression of rather mainstream confusions. And rather than get obsessed with the so-called extremists, as all of our security agencies do, as to who they are, what they read, what they do, what they get up to, how to interdict them, we would be far better off as a society getting obsessed with our own mainstream confusions, our own failure of belief in the people around us who truly make history.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Thanks, everybody. Right, so actually, I'm going to go out to the audience straight away because there isn't that much time. Just a few thoughts before we do go out. I mean, guess to slightly rewrite the title. I mean, it's not terribly useful to ask how much politics is in it and how much religion in it, which I think you were right about that, Emma. I mean, I think the role of religion is always a guise for something. You look at the forms of Islamic movement that have been taken over the last few decades, last 200 years, very, very different forms, the same religion. So I think that it is never, if it takes Islamic guise, Islam is not the explanation of the form, it's just a veil. So if it were religious, it's not the result of the Quran, right? It's the result of something else. Couple of disagreements that are kind of emerging on the panel. First of all, is it a political form, as you're suggesting, or very much a post-political form, as Bill is suggesting? And then the origin, you know, you're suggesting it's actually distinct in that it originates overseas, whereas Bill's saying it's distinct in originating in the West. And then finally, just I guess a kind of in response to Bill's statement that it's nihilism, you know, they do seem to believe rather a lot. You know, they do die for something, and they do actually have a level of discipline and coherence which it does stand apart from everyday nihilism. So why might that be? Okay, right, over to you guys.
Bill Derody, I very much like what you said. It's interesting to kind of work out, you know, how it is that you define what something is, whether something is terrorist or not. And there were two instances in France, and we both know them very well, and they both involved somebody taking a vehicle and killing scores. And one of them happened to be Muslim, and it was a big truck, and the other one happened to be German, and it was an aeroplane into the French Alps. And it's very difficult sometimes to work out, well, why is one considered terrorism and the other not?
Thanks very much, all really interesting. But I think I would argue that you need to actually separate what's going on in the Middle East and what's going on at home. So I think these things are related, of course. I think what's going on in the Middle East is, you know, basically what ISIS say they want to do. They want to establish a caliphate. Now, it's certainly post-political in that it's not a state, and I don't think that's a particularly useful way of thinking about it. I mean, not that anyone on the panel was, but, you know, I don't think that debate, it's post-political. But nonetheless, you know, ISIS, we know, as Dr. Shaw said about the oil, they've got social media offices. You know, ISIS, when they establish control, they do not just commit the atrocity that Bill talked about. It's not just a million Paris attacks. You know, they establish control. They tax people. So there is an establishment of the caliphate, whatever we wanted to call it. However, what I do think is different, and I would say agree with Bill's characterization, is what's going on here. And that is the export of our, you know, young people to ISIS. And I think that, of course, they are related. But, you know, if ISIS are vanquished tomorrow, and maybe they will be by the end of the year, who knows, or next year if Hillary Clinton doesn't take us all into World War III. But, you know, if ISIS are vanquished, we will still have that problem in Britain and in France and in Belgium. So I really think, just for the sake of clarity of understanding, we do need to think there are two related but separate, and definitely the domestic problem that we have is one of extreme nihilism and a problem with values. You know, I don't think that ISIS in Syria and Iraq necessarily have that problem, although certainly they will use, you know, our nihilistic young people.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, how consistent is IS actually? Or is it something that, depending on who you are and what you're looking for, you can find it within IS? So if you're looking for something that's very religiously driven and very motivated, you can find that. If you're looking for something that's historical, you can find that. If you're just looking for violence's sake, you can also find that. And this is important because, yes, we have IS in Iraq and Syria, but we also have now groups that are saying that they are allied to IS quite far away, actually. We have offshoots coming up in Libya, we have Boko Haram in Nigeria. So we have organizations that are in different contexts. And so not only do we have a problem within Europe and on our own shores, we have it also elsewhere. And I wonder to what extent this is an organization that really does have any particular unity to it.
I just wanted to echo a point about the attraction, the adventure of going to war. And even though nothing is quite the same as anything else, it isn't the first time that many young men from this country have gone out to fight in a violent civil war and committed atrocities. It happened in very large numbers in the 1930s in Spain, where people who were highly motivated and they went because of a kind of narrative of making a difference and so on. And they did commit atrocities, things that they would never do at home. It's not the same in lots of ways because they don't bring it home. But I think that the attraction of the adventure of going to war and the fact, therefore, of the war as an engine, one among many, but as an engine of this, I completely agree about it. I think I'm agreeing, but I was glad to hear anyway.
Thanks very much. Right, who wants to come back in on any of those? So questions of whether it's the Western and the Middle Eastern phenomenon completely different or not. Bill?
Oh, I completely agree with the point. It's just that I make no pretenses of being an Islamic scholar. I'm not based in the Middle East. I'm not in a position to change the situation there. I am based in the UK. I think I can talk to the authorities here about what I think the problems are here. So I totally agree that there's a distinction to be made. I think on the point about attraction to adventure, I think there's probably an element of that, but I usually pose it the other way around, is that really what we're looking at is a rejection of the West, rather than an amazing attraction to what might be on offer in Syria. And that again means that it behoves us to understand what it is that why it is that we're failing to provide young, energetic, bright, highly educated people who are looking for meaning and purpose in their life, why it is that contemporary Western society fails to provide them with any sense of purpose and meaning. Just one point I wanted to quickly pick up, if I may, on Emma's narrative, which is that I do not think that asking them why they're doing what they're doing, it's not as simple as that. And then you see what they say. I mean, if you were to ask Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, why he sliced up however many prostitutes he did around the West Midlands and Yorkshire, whatever, it was, he said that God made him do it. I think most of us believe that God did not make him do it, and therefore you don't simply take people at face value. I do think that we need to understand this phenomena as using religion and constructed around religion, but not necessarily as inherently being driven by it. I often make the point that Islam is their motif rather than their motive. And indeed, ISIS has become the motif. I've just had a master's student do a dissertation on how many different groups around the world have in the last 2 or 3 years sworn allegiance to ISIS. And it's quite amazing. It's like suddenly it's become, that's the group you want to associate yourself with. That's the one that most evidently scares people in the West and causes concern. So everyone from Boko Haram to Al-Shabaab and right across to the Philippines and beyond suddenly has sworn allegiance to ISIS. I don't think that necessarily tells us much.
Yeah.
I just want to say that I don't think that actually that asking ISIS what they think of themselves gives you the full story. I mean, obviously, you have to understand that when you're listening to what ISIS is saying, usually the source it's coming from is propaganda. But I don't think that it's irrelevant. So you say that the Yorkshire Ripper said that God told him to do it. It's almost irrelevant because nobody is suggesting that God did tell him to do it, and that implies something, some kind of knowledge about it. It doesn't matter. The point is that it does tell us something that he thought that God wanted him to do it. And therefore, I just don't think that listening to what a person says their motives are is taking anything away from your understanding of the reasons why they behave. It definitely.
What you're saying basically that if people say I'm doing it for Allah and for Islam, and it's then wrong to say it has nothing to do with Islam. Islam is a religion of peace, etc. Mm-hmm. If they say they're Muslim, then there is an element of that.
I think that you only learn more by listening, at least considering the things that they say. It doesn't mean necessarily that it's the only cause. Somebody might say that they're doing it because God told them to do it, but they might have other motivations that they're not telling you. And there are other ways that you can discover those motives, but ignoring the reasons why they believe that they're doing something, I don't think is necessarily helpful.
I think it's really important on this particular debate that, and I agree with Bill here on kind of where the bits around understanding and kind of reflecting on ourselves has got to situate itself, because we always presume that the other within this is the problem. And what I mean by that is it doesn't mean that by listening you start to empathize. It's the bit around listening. So when we talk about preventing violent extremism, which is a government strategy, for example, quite often the debate is very polarized because each side is saying my version, my side, my research, etc., is the bit that gives you that critical glue in terms of trying to make sense of things. So, for example, to try to understand why some of our young people, around 800, who've gone to territories in IS, why they've made that journey, needs to start from that basis of trying to make us feel a bit uncomfortable. Why is it that they have these grievances? Again, the emphasis being on listening does not mean sympathizing. So what is it about identity in terms of our country and our essence of belonging, where they feel that something that does have terror and that does practice political and extreme violence is the space that is going to listen to them? Where does belonging fit into this country? Where do we kind of, again, draw the line in terms of when some of our young people who feel they have a better way of making a difference, a better way of having their voices heard? The unfortunate thing in terms of the 3 girls who went, for example, to Syria, one of them, we hear that she wanted to come back and was looking to flee, but was attacked by bombs on her return journey back. So again, where do some of these kind of questions raise themselves? And in terms of kind of the essence of identity, what is it that we need to kind of listen to in terms of where adventure has to lie as well for some of these young people?
Thanks very much. Emma.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, on the political component, I don't see ISIS as... it can get more political than this. It's about state establishment. They have a project of state building. They provide, when they take control, they crack down on crime, provide social services, more or less provide structures that initially were not functioning, even in areas, Assad-free areas in Syria. They usually have this very brutal judicial system, but very effective in many ways. Inter-tribal conflict resolution patterns, and then make all this as propaganda. So you'll see this more or less in propaganda with about 6 or 7 languages. So they translate this for recruitment purposes. One thing that their sympathizers really hate when you tell them basically this is how Saudi Arabia was established, the first Saudi state and the third Saudi state. This is how it was established, except that in the end there was a pragmatic tribal leadership. The House of Saud basically took power and compromised with everybody. So they carved the territory, and the militants that wanted to expand further, fight the British in Transjordan, in Iraq, and in Yemen. The House of Saud basically took weapons from Britain and defeated them in an internal strife. So when you tell that this is ultimately it's going to be the Baghdadi Arabia or something like that, of course they don't like that. But it is very political. It's a state-building project, very extreme, very brutal. But it is the region if you look from Morocco to Iran, basically, this mix of arms and religion is the most effective tool to gain political power and then remain in political power, because you kind of legitimate the brutal violence of many of these regimes via you use the arms intensively, and then you legitimate this by religious institutions and propaganda, basically, using it very selectively. So that on one end. On the other end, the idea of ideology and narrative, how much do they matter? And the ideology in terms of how it does not determine the behavior, as I mentioned earlier, but it can be altered. We have jihadist groups who were, first, jihadist groups are, again, very different in terms of their objectives, in terms of what is the relations with violence. Jihadism is basically the whole idea that the most effective mean for social and political change is by using violence, and in some of its categories, the most legitimate mean for social and political change is by using political violence. So jihadist organizations altered their ideologies. We saw them transform in some cases when the opportunity was there between, especially 2011 and 2013. Some of these groups turned into political parties, engaged in constitutional assemblies, compromises, mainstream compromises, and so on. So it's you can alter the ideology. It's not something sacred that will not be altered. The problem with the current, what IS does is it uses ideology and narrative as almost a strategic communication policy. It has the message is very complex. If it's a mix of this historical signals, very selective episodes of history being thrown in your face with music and with poetry and with verses, a very selective political discourse, selecting specific spots in history and then throwing them in politics and then throwing them in your face, and then a selective theology, legitimating all this with the religious verses and fatwas from scholars who lived or theologians and clerics who lived in the Middle Ages. And sometimes also giving this socio-psychological boost of glorifying the perpetrators of violence. So it's a mixed message. But if you dissect this message, every bit of it is extremely weak. If you get into a theological debate, they will never win. It's basically they ignore the fundamentals of jurisprudence, fundamentals of Islamic jurisprudence. They totally ignore it. So they won't win on that. The history part, if you have like a more complex of the dynamics of conflict and cooperation between the Muslims and the non-Muslims, or inter-Muslims cooperation and conflicts, whether Sunni or Shiites, again they will lose this battle, and so on. So the dissecting of the message and then dismantling it is not a difficult job. The problem is the bombardment and the how they sell this message to mainly youth that are vulnerable, that do not understand how deceiving the level of deception in this message. Part of the issue as well is the issue in narratives and ideologies is the issue of the messenger. You need sometimes the message can be dissected easily, but the messenger is trusted by the vulnerable person, and therefore the messenger convince him or her to get recruited. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, we're going to do a final round of questions and points.
It's a very good question, who are we and what do we want? And in a way, I think the whole weekend sort of collides into this discussion. Because after 9/11, we asked ourselves the question, why do they hate us? But perhaps, it's important to ask the right questions first, and it's why do we hate ourselves? And I think, because much of the narrative, and narrative is important, has been generated right here. It's been generated in London and in Paris and in New York and Sorbonne. The whole narrative, actually, of dead white males, of raping and pillaging, of how disgusting the West is, consumerism, and identity. I mean, I think your question is a very important one, Dr. Ashur. What does it mean about identity and everything? But actually, I think there's a correlation between the nihilistic, juvenile, destructive explosion and the "you can't offend me." You're not allowed to say that. It's outrageous that you're saying these things to me, and this offensive. In fact, in many ways, the nihilism that we see of explosion is really just a more violent form of the outrage that we see on campuses, that you're not allowed to say that. You've offended me. It's disgusting. You're disgusting. We're all disgusting. And it does seem to me that rather than looking for solutions abroad and elsewhere, this really core question of who we are. I mean, the only connection, I think, where it stands between what's happening in the Middle East and here is that ourselves, we've lost sight of everything. So in our narrative of dead white males and we don't know what we're doing in a post-Cold War moment, we go and interfere in the world without any sense of a mission or interest or anything, and leave a real mess to be filled with a vacuum of our own creation of nihilism. And we create it at home, we create it internationally. We have to address it here. And I wonder what the panel thinks of that.
I think when people, after a terror attack, there tends to be a focus on, what are we doing wrong for these people to be radicalized? And I think that there are some issues on behalf of Western society in terms of how we behave. But I think there's always also a lack of how maybe the Muslim community looks at themselves and the role in which parents play in the radicalization of their children, maybe not explicitly, but for example, these children or these young people who go out to Syria, they may not have actually heard from their parents that, you should go and fight for an organization like ISIS. But they grow up in an environment that does, not everybody, of course, not all Muslims, but a significant proportion grow up in families that do see people who are non-believers as infidels. So if you are growing up in that environment, and that is the fertile ground, that's fertile ground for you to become radicalized once you come into contact with some very, very abhorrent material online, or people within your mosque or wherever it may be. So I think that's kind of not discussed enough, and I'd be interested to know what some of the panel think about that.
It was interesting, I think, how keen the panel were to play down the link between Islam and the Islamic State, particularly by drawing a dichotomy between politics and religion, or nihilism and religion. But it doesn't seem to me that politics and religion, especially in the context of Islam, are incompatible, or that nihilism and religion are incompatible. I think I understand why people do this. The same thing you saw after 9/11. Everyone's keen to build bridges with Muslims in our society, but some of the things that Islamic State do, like trying to bring on a battle around Tabuk, or refusing to make alliances with anyone else and believing that through pure faith they can conquer all their enemies, seem to be best explained by viewing it as a religious phenomenon, at least in part. But obviously there's a real merit in not encouraging Islam, not alienating Islamic members of our Islamic fellow citizens, and not drawing up divisions. So my question is whether it's worth playing down the religious element, as people seem keen to do, in order to increase social cohesion, or whether it's worth taking that risk in order to get closer perhaps to the truth.
I'd like to hear from the panel in terms of the issue of young British Muslim men sometimes becoming extreme, and obviously problems with the Islamic State. Could this be a response to what sometimes seemed to be the liberal extremism of society, in that even if you were Muslim, you joined the army, you did everything right, but you expressed fairly moderate views in what could be considered moderate views, i.e. I would like the female members of my family to dress modestly, I don't have a problem with polygamy and don't see why it should be illegal, and homosexual marriage should be illegal, and that I would like, that to be the model of my family. I don't feel you'd get a lot of acceptance from people, even if you said, I love Britain, it's the best country in the world, I would die for Britain. But just saying that you'd like, the females in your family, even just your family, to dress modestly, let alone other women, you would be demonized, I think it's fair to say, by a lot of people on the left who probably say you're a monster controlling your females. And on the right, obviously, who might have more respect for those core values, they'll say, oh, he's a Muslim, he's my enemy. So it seems difficult, because on the left you have people who have like this sort of superficial thing, oh, we like Muslims and we feel a bit sorry for them, don't really respect those values that are so important, like core spiritual values of honor and family and a belief in something more than just Tinder and empty consumerism. And on the right, you have people like, yeah, I really agree with, with some of these things, but this guy's basically my enemy, and, there's too many of them. So how do you fit into a society where the people on the left or your right, neither of them really, seem to get along? I mean, okay, there's exceptions, but it seems to me like that would drive a lot of people, the fact that it doesn't seem to be a clear place for that lack of respect for core values, just literally respect, not agreeing, but just respecting them.
The offspring of immigrants around the world often seem to feel alienated or at least disconnected from both their parental values and culture and the values and culture of the majority communities in the country that their parents have migrated to. I'm wondering to what extent such disconnection might liberate younger people to be susceptible to radicalization such as we've seen. And I notice Zubaydah has written a book which in part seems to be about families of violent extremists, so she might have something relevant to say on this.
Yeah, so I want to focus on the problem in the UK rather than the sort of foreign picture, and kind of pose the devil advocate question: to what extent is it a problem? You talked about 800 people over the last maybe 4 years. More people than that have died in road accidents over that time. To what extent, by focusing the discussion around this very small minority, are we not having the kind of conversations that we've talked about we want to have about the main body of the society who don't go out and commit terrorist atrocities? To what extent is just that small fraction of people? There'll always be people in a very large society who, for whatever reason, want to go out and commit hideous acts. Should we really focus on that? Shouldn't we be having the discussion a lot more away from that? And that's actually a really red herring to making progress.
So I just wanted to challenge a couple of the comments that we heard earlier from the panel, that something about all human purpose is a vanity since 1989. I mean, if that's the case, why are any of us here discussing these topics? Why does anyone work in a charity? Why is anyone a teacher, a doctor? Is it just the money? Are we all living a life of hedonism? I found that something that was a little shocking to me, and quite a negative take on human character. And the idea also that we've given up on the power of persuasion. But I mean, we saw, even in this country, so forget Debicq and the propaganda that we've heard about, we saw huge campaigns for a referendum earlier this summer trying to persuade people to think about their decisions. I don't think we have given up on the power of persuasion in this country or elsewhere. And also the idea that we're not in a position to interdict others until we know our own views. Well, if people are out to potentially kill innocent people in random acts of violence, I think we are in a position to interdict them, because I think a basic right is to live in a secure environment where you aren't targeted in that way. So that was all really that I wanted to say.
Okay, we'll come back to the panel now for final thoughts. I mean, there seems to be different versions of the kind of "it's about us" view, which are quite, I mean, there's on the one hand a sort of view that we're not understanding enough maybe, and so after 9/11 you did have a sort of apology, I'm very, very sorry, we must be more understanding. But then there might be a kind of conservative, it's all about us, we need to stand our ground more. And the French de-radicalization programs tend to be, sort of quite postmodern and that sort of thing, and more understanding. But occasionally they sort of send in a grand old man of French politics who sort of stands up and gives this very grand speech. And so I think those are two very different approaches to the crisis of values and the disengagement, either apologizing or kind of standing up, and which should it be? Okay, final thoughts, 1 to 2 minutes. Bill.
Okay, well, obviously I apologize to the gentleman who spoke last if you were thrown by my rhetorical flourishes. I'm trying to make the point that compared certainly to, a generation ago, most of the debates I encounter within universities always end up with people saying, you can't possibly know, it's not possible, that it's not possible to change things. All human life is determined either by our neurons or by our families, or by, and there's a quite palpable sense that attempting to be ambitious is arrogant, to want to change the world is a delusion. So I think it's quite a prevalent sense. I'm not, obviously, maybe to say all human purpose is vanity is a step too far, but what I'm trying to convey is what they are trying to convey. And obviously, yes, you're right. We're here because we still believe in purpose. People still have families and work for charities, as you say. But when, you know, the democratic decision of this country to leave the EU is derided as a vote by morons, it should ring alarm bells in certain people's heads as to how democracy is viewed. There's a number of questions about Islam, and are we avoiding the sensitive subject of touching on that? And I think that the point I would convey there is that, first of all, there is no single Muslim community. You'd have to talk about which particular community you're talking about. Is it Sunni, Shia, or you know, Wahhabi Islamism, or whatever? All the different constellations of belief, which I think Omar made the point very well, that what we see in IS is a remarkable ability to make up Islam as they go along. Although, having said that, you know, Islam is, you know, like many religions, you know, a process in becoming. It's never been a fixed thing. And, you know, the Islam that you presume to be the, you know, authentic, moderate Islam is itself very much a construct of the previous century. What I do find remarkable for my sins is occasionally I Google and collect videos of young women explaining why they wear the veil. And that becomes very interesting because they often forget to mention religion at all. And you would have thought that would be possibly the primary reason. But actually, no, you get a litany of, I don't like men looking at me, why do Western women wear bikinis and get away with it, which I have to say I don't notice quite as much, evidently. So they're into caricaturing just as much. And, you know, obviously the caricatures are a bit problematic, but they internalize those caricatures of Western licentiousness, which is an odd reversal, actually, of the Oriental other as it was presented 100 years ago. Somebody mentioned being alienated from values and being caught between two sets of values. I think it's the woman there. I think that actually, and there to de-spirit the gentleman, like, yet again, I think they're not being provided with that many values when they get here. And actually, that's what they find most discombobulating. So they leave a certain amount of values behind, and actually there's a reluctance to instill a set of values here that are clear. A couple of other points, very briefly, if I may. Okay, sorry.
Choose one.
I'll finish on Omar then. You know, because I mean, he makes a semi-convincing case that IS is a state-building project. I disagree. I don't think that collecting taxes at gunpoint is part of building a state. It's state building maybe in the American understanding of state building, but that's never worked. That's not how states come about. And so, ironically, there again, they show how they have internalized a Western discourse and Western approach. They, you know, in very much the same terms as the US was on a state-building missions in Afghanistan or anywhere else. It doesn't work.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay, really snappy. Do better.
Can't promise the snappy bit, but I'll start off with something that David Anderson QC, who's the independent reviewer of terror legislation, had said when he was first appointed, that bee stings kill more people than terrorists do. So he started off in that role. So that means that don't avoid the discussion, but in terms of having avoid bees, but ensure that we have the context around this topic understood as well. And kind of, again, being short and snappy, I think it's really hard to kind of summarize. I am the child of immigrants. And I think it's really important for people to understand that we are not exclusive species. We are part of the process of integration. It takes time, and almost people want this kind of instant response of suddenly proclaiming your Britishness. It doesn't happen instantly. So therefore, suddenly kind of conjuring up this otherness in terms of women not being told to do X, Y, and Z. I'm part of that family of discussions that continues to happen even to this day. And so therefore, to assume that Muslims behave differently precludes the fact that also that I'm British. And so therefore, why is it that my faith is more important as a British person than my religion? And what does one determine in terms of the other from that point of view as well? And it's important that we don't then go into the aspects of feeling that we are being politically incorrect when we say these things. Sure, you have your right to say what you have to believe and what you assume to be correct of other people. So I know lots of people who have worn the veil, who choose to wear the veil, and I'm quite happy wearing the veil for a number of reasons. And quite often it's not always religion from that point of view, but because of safety for some people. I may not agree with the burqa, for example, but I, again, feel that if we don't try to understand from a British point of view of some of our differences, of some people living in our country without making them feel that they are part of the problem and so therefore need to come up with that solution, then we're still going about it the wrong way so many years down the line. And so again, skipping back to another topic in terms of families, some of the families that we've interviewed in terms of people who have subscribed either to far-right extremism or Islamist extremism, quite often the families don't actually know why they have, first of all, whether they even joined a movement. And some of the individuals that we interviewed who had exited movements, not necessarily because they don't believe in the ideology anymore, but because of age, they still don't know what that journey, the parents don't know that journey as to why they made that journey into extremism, or even the fact that then they've exited. And their understanding in terms of where they are now is different from both sides, from the parent side and from the kind of exit side as well.
Okay, thanks so much. Right, Emma,
I'll keep this very, very short,
fantastic.
I promise. I think it's obvious that I disagree with Bill. I agree with everybody who's made a point about us having a problem with hating ourselves. I think that part of the solution to the problem is that we need to be more confident and more assertive, coming from a position of our own intellectual and political history, being more assertive in our confidence in democracy. So I will be very, very brief in saying that I clearly disagree with Bill. I think that the problem overall is actually a problem of utopian thinking, and not just in Islamic State, but in the West as well, and all of the fallacies that come along with utopian thinking. I think that the solution possibly that is just something worth thinking about is Edmund Burke put forward the idea that it was instead of imposing ideology top-down, as you would see in Islamic State or in the French Revolution, that instead it's a much better idea to have us solve our problems in little platoons, person to person, rather than by imposing these large ideologies. And I think if we approach society in that way, then we will have in our interpersonal interactions, those interpersonal reactions naturally provide us with meaning in our lives. And I think that that is possibly the way forward. I'll just leave it there.
Thanks very much. Okay, Emma, final thought.
I do not disagree with Bill. I just wanted to say something very briefly on the social cohesion and religiosity. I think the system here, and this is a success in democracies, is to be able to strong enough, secure enough, and flexible enough to accommodate these differences and to be able to, when necessary, challenge them without making the system collapse. I think the idea of non-violent conflict resolution mechanism is the main, I guess, achievement of Western democracies, especially internally. Very briefly on the state building project, and this is where I disagree with Bill. The idea that IS has a plan for state building is there, is there since 2006, and we have enough data for that. Whether this will be a successful model, this is a different story. First and second Saudi states collapsed, the Taliban system collapsed. IS may collapse tomorrow, we don't know. No, not necessarily tomorrow, probably in a year or so. But the idea that they have a plan and they are willing to sacrifice sweat, blood, and lives for it, don't be mistaken, they do. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks.